Hello, everyone, and welcome to URU's Curricular Analytics Project Town Hall. We're just delighted that you're joining us for today's special presentation of preliminary results from David M. Dueber and Michael D. Toland, known to us all in the Curricular Analytics Project community as David and Michael, members of the CAP leadership team. They are more formally in the case of Dr. Toland, the executive director of the Herb Innovation Center at the University of Toledo, and in the case of Dr. Dueber, a postdoctoral researcher at the same Herb Innovation Center at the University of Toledo. And we're grateful to them, to all of you for joining us today for this presentation. Lots of folks are joining just now, so we're not going to begin for just a minute or two so that people can transition from one meeting to another, of course. And I just wanted to take a moment. I'm Steve Dandino, if you're not already familiar, the executive director of URU and the PI for the CAP project. I just want to give you a couple quick highlights, a couple just words of things we're learning recently before we hand things over to Dr. Dueber, who will be the main presenter today. I'm told I made a mistake with Dr. Dueber's title. Forgive me for that. He is a research assistant professor at the Herb Innovation Center at the University of Toledo, which is awesome. So just a couple of quick updates then. First, a thank you to Ascendium Education Group, as always, for their support of the Curricular Analytics Project. It was a 3-year original project, but we've extended it to a 4th year because there's so much data to analyze, both curricular data and student progress and success data. On that front, as I've shared with folks in our communications, Greg Heilman at the University of Arizona and his colleagues are making great progress on reports that are going to go out to all our CAP project partner universities. That's 30 universities, and each one will receive an individualized report. And I just got a quick preview of it yesterday, and it looks great. I think it's going to be a superb way to stimulate conversation and probably also raise a lot of additional questions, campus-specific questions. We look forward to that process, which we hope to begin in early January. And then also in January, we're excited to have Drs. Toland and Dueber also present at our URU National Conference. What is being presented today is a preview of that. And then we'll have more on our transfer pivot, which those of you who are at the University of Arizona in 2023 or at the Emory University meeting earlier this year in 2024 in June, know is a part of what we're doing with Curricular Analytics is applying it in the form of a transfer portal, which has enormous implications for improving student success for students who are transferring from one to another institution. That includes high schools to universities. I see we're over 50, close to 60 participants already, which is great. We really appreciate everyone joining. We are recording this town hall, and we'll post it at URU's website, make it available to all CAP and anyone who's interested in learning more about curricular analytics. There is a lot of growing interest, and will even be the subject of a Routledge book in a new series called Advancing Equity and Excellence in Undergraduate Education, a focus on research universities, one of planned 10 to 12 volumes in that series. And we're looking forward to the curricular analytics volume being the very first. We'll need lots of help from you all who are joining this town hall to participate in that project, and I'll be offering more on that very soon. I think without further ado, now that we're at 60 participants, let's turn things over to Dr. Dueber, who's, along with Dr. Toland, created a wonderful presentation for you today. Thanks to you both, David and Michael, for your work on this project.
You're welcome, Steve. It's been fun. So the first thing I need to say about this presentation is to highlight this word preliminary. We keep talking about data, data cleaning and data management, data collection, so on and so forth. And it just happens that we've had an institution modify all their curricular data just in the last week and say, hey, we want you to use this instead. So it's preliminary because some of that work is still ongoing. And also, as you'll see, there are some particularities and strange things that happened in the analyses that we're still working to figure out the most appropriate way to analyze this data. It is very complicated in its structure, and we've consulted with some of the some people who are leaders in complicated data structure analyses, and that work is nearing completion but still ongoing. So there's a little bit of, we're refining this still, but I'm giving some estimated completion dates for components of the project, so you can see that yes, we will have official publishable results very soon. But today, still a little preliminary. The broad strokes are, you can take home and say yes. The big picture things are all going to stay the same, but some of the details will change. So I just want you to be aware of that. All right. Arrow keys to one. There we go. So we've given presentations to you before on the first 3 steps: the research questions, data collection, data prep, and cleaning. And now it's time to start reporting on analyses. So I know you all have been looking forward to this moment for quite a while. I sure know I have. And just a little bit of background on CAP, which you are all very familiar with, but some of these background things I'm giving you, like I'm going over a little bit to set some context that'll help you understand what happens later in the presentation. So we measured a number of student outcomes, everything from degree completion to number of hours earned, credit hours earned, to first year retention, and so on and so forth. And we want to see how they're related to not only curricular complexity of the program they're in. Do students in higher complexity programs take longer to graduate, for example? But also how they related to equity-focused student characteristics. So we've captured a number of demographic and student preparedness variables that really speak to issues of equity. And that's not all. We're interested in those things, but also how they interact. One of the major questions we posed early on was whether or not curricular complexity, this notion of how complicated it is to navigate the curriculum of a degree program, whether or not that's harder for some students than others. And so that's really the goal here, is one, does curricular complexity matter in what I'll call a marginal level? And marginal sort of means averaged across the entire population. But also, does it matter more or less for certain groups of people? And with that in mind, the biggest question by far that the CAP leadership team has gotten from participants in the CAP project is, what do we do with this CAP stuff? What are we supposed to look at? What's important? What can we do? And I'm not going to answer that question 100%. That's not really my role. My role is analysis. But I do think it's worth noting that when we talk about curricular complexity and those beautiful graphs on the website, that there's different components to curricular complexity, some of which we have control over and some of which we don't. And so some universities, some institutions, for example, have foreign language requirements and others don't. And so that creates an institution level determinant of curricular complexity, because there are different core requirements that have different complexities associated with them. And for the most part, we really can't do anything about that. And analytically speaking, we have 26 universities, and 26 isn't really a large enough sample size to determine whether or not those institution level determinants of curricular complexity are meaningfully important, right? There's 1 million students in our data set, but there's only 26 institutions. And so institution level variables, we don't really have statistical power to address questions involving them. So we're not going to be mentioning curricular complexity at the institution level again, except to be aware that it exists. And it's something that you know, if you're a department chair looking to revamp your department's curricular map for your degrees, that's not something you can manipulate. Likewise, another determinant of curricular complexity is due to the degree program. So this would be like mechanical engineering is a degree program, or mathematics is a degree program. And a degree program will have a network of required student learning objectives. There's certain things a student needs to know in order to be given a mechanical engineering degree. And those learning objectives inherently have sort of prerequisite relationships built into them. So no matter what you do, if you're a mechanical engineering program, you're going to have a highly complicated curriculum. You don't have control over that. Those student learning objectives have a complicated are in a complicated network. Sometimes those student learning objectives, they could be defined like by an accrediting agency, for example, that you have to do these things in order to give a degree in your degree program. And so once again, if we're in the perspective of a curriculum committee in a department, that's not something we can control. We have to satisfy those student learning objectives. And so there's sort of a minimum amount of complexity to a degree program that we cannot change. And that varies from degree program to degree program. That minimum level of complexity is going to be a lot higher in that mechanical engineering degree program I mentioned than in the mathematics degree program I mentioned. Then there's a third component, curricular complexity, and this is the part that we can change, that we can alter, and that's the departmental. So if you've come to these presentations that Michael and I have given before, we are ever so slightly changing some of our language. We're using this word department. So the Department of Mechanical Engineering at the University of Arizona is a department, whereas mechanical engineering is a degree program and the University of Arizona is an institution. So this is a specific degree program at a specific institution, is a department. And the curriculum committees in a department can kind of choose what content goes into which courses, how the courses are sequenced, and if they have additional student learning objectives above what is required by, say, an accreditation agency, or just above what is common in the field, perhaps. And so departments will add some complexity because of the way that their courses take shape. And that's the part that we can change. So if we want to look at a particular curriculum and decide, is this curriculum complex, we need to be comparing it to other curricula of the same degree program. And so on the website, it's pretty easy to search by degree program and look at different schools and what their curricular maps look like and compare them to yours and be able to figure out, hey, ours is way more complicated or way less complicated, or ours is pretty similar to all the rest of them, and kind of get an idea of how content is sequenced in other departments. And that's really for me at least, that's the big value of something like the Curricular Analytics website for universities, is being able to look at other degree programs and compare them to yours, and how does that network of required coursework look in one degree program versus another. And so that's the part that you can change. You can change what content goes into which courses, how courses are sequenced. This isn't necessarily something that is part of curricular complexity, but you could change when courses are taken, first year versus second year versus third year, and so on. So that department level thing that we can change, that's malleable, is really the focus of, analytically speaking, is the focus of our work. Because if we look at curricular complexity at the degree program level, well, it's not very interesting to say that more complex degree programs take longer to graduate from. That's just sort of common sense. But do departments within that degree program that are more complex, do they have longer relative to other departments in the same degree program? Do they take longer to graduate? That's a really interesting question. That's powerful. That's what we're going to be looking at in this presentation. All right. So I talked about curricular complexities having these three components: an institution, a program, and a department level component. And it's useful to understand that the majority of the variability in curricular complexity in our sample comes from the degree programs. Some degree programs are very complex, some are not. And like I said, we can't change that. So the part that we can change is about a third of the variability in curricular complexity. And this is one of the reasons why it's really important not to compare a specific degree program to some like global average of curricular complexities, or to other programs that are different programs, right? You don't want to be making those comparisons, because a high curricular complexity for math and a high curricular complexity for criminal justice are very different. And so that's kind of the point of this, that there's a mathematical statistical model that we can fit that will separate these components of curricular complexity. So all the analyses I'm reporting on today separate curricular complexity into these different levels, and then use those different components as predictors and models. Okay, so everything is from if you're familiar with a multi-level structural equation modeling perspective. There exist equivalent models in a mixed effects framework, but they are much more complicated to fit and interpret in that framework. So we use a structural equation modeling framework. So I mentioned that some programs have high complexity, some programs have low complexity, and a lot are kind of in the middle. These medium complexity programs in the center that I've listed, about a third of the programs have curricular complexity, like average curricular complexity for the degree program, within 20 or 30 curricular complexity points of these. So about a third of all programs have very similar average level of curricular complexities. And when you look at this, you can see it's a wide variety of things, everything from actuary to finance to construction management and cybersecurity. A lot of different programs are in this sort of center. The high complexity programs and the low complexity programs, however, it's easier to kind of look at the name of a program, figure out what you know about it, and determine, oh yeah, this is gonna be really high complexity, or yeah, this is not gonna have very high complexity. The high complexity programs, the ones with very high curricular complexities, and these might be average curricular complexities in the across degree program, across universities for this degree program of several hundred, are engineering and sort of biomedical related programs tend to be very complex. And then the low complexity programs that might have average curricular complexity across institutions of 50 to 60 are things like the studies degree, classic degrees, not listed here, but language degrees are also very low complexity. Those are the things that you need to kind of say, okay, where does my program fit? Is it a more complex program? Is it a low complex program? And then compare within your program and very similar programs. Now, the next bit, and this is kind of a technical point I'm trying to make, is that I call this within degree program variability of curricular complexity. And so the notion is, we take a particular degree program, chemical engineering, and we looked across all 26 schools, and I think 18 of them have a chemical engineering program. And we have the curricular complexity of those 18 schools. And we compute the standard deviation of those curricular complexities, and it was around 100. And then we did that for each and every degree program and plotted their standard deviation of those curricular complexities on this plot. And what we found was that there's sort of a normal level of variability across schools of 50-ish points. So for the most part, there's an average plus or minus 50 range for curricular complexity. But some of them, especially some of the more complicated curriculum degree programs, have much, much higher variability. So there is I forget exactly which degree program it is, but there's a degree program that has curricular complexities ranging from, I think, about 100 to around 530. So that particular degree program, there's clearly immense difference in how the curriculum is structured. But for the most part, you know, if you're comparing two different programs and the difference in curricular complexity is around 50 or 60 or 40 or something like that, you could think to yourself, yeah, this is sort of the normal amount of variability across schools. But if you have one curriculum that's more complex than another by 100 or 120 points, you can probably safely say to yourself, whoa, that's a really big difference. So when we're asking the question, what is the big difference in, what is the big difference in curricular complexity? Well, it's going to matter based on what degree program you're talking about. Some degree programs have very little variability, and so 30 points of difference might be big. Some degree programs have very high variability, and so 30 points of curricular complexity difference might be very small. So it's going to depend on what kind of program you're in. And the reports that Steve mentioned that Greg is going to be sending out will contain all that kind of information in a digestible way for you. So you'll be able to look at individual programs and say, hey, this is where this individual program fits compared to its peers. And is that a big deal or is that not a big deal? Is it really low? Is it really high? Well, those reports are going to answer a lot of those questions for you. So, and those are coming along very nicely. I don't know exactly when they'll be done, but not another year, right? Another weeks to maybe a month or two. But I think Greg could give a more exact answer if he wants, if he's on. Anyway.
Now or later?
Now would be nice because I'm talking about it.
Sorry, David, I wasn't sure. Hi, all. Yeah, I think in January, we're trying to work to get like a first cut of this data, just the analysis of curricula. So we are still working hard to validate, you know, every time we kind of do work on it, we find additional issues. So I think we might even have one more round with all of you. So we'll send you a report, and I'm sure, I know looking at our own data, there are a few programs that I see and I'm like, ooh, so I need to make sure that that's correct. So as David mentioned, we've got the ability to break it down by what I call discipline. And I think when David is saying degree program here, he means the SIP, 2-digit SIP or 4-digit SIP?
4-digit SIP.
4-digit SIP. So broken down by 2-digit SIP and by 4-digit SIP, kind of where do your programs fit relative to the others in this study? And as David has framed very well, kind of why disciplines are kind of different according to how they kind of construct their curricula and how you fit into your discipline. I mean, this is well known in higher ed. We identify more with our discipline in many cases than our institution. And John Lombardi calls that the guild that you're a part of, and that is the thing that kind of drives how we construct our curriculum in many cases. But as David mentioned, also there are a few things that have, I think, what I've seen is minor effect, you know, how you construct your gen ed or language requirements maybe slightly tweak things. I think in Texas, there's maybe a bit more because the gen ed tends to be bigger there. But in any event, the reports that we'll try to have to you kind of as a first cut in January, Steve and I were kind of going over that yesterday. That's the plan, probably late January to give us wiggle room.
Thanks, Greg. So to come back to this idea that curricular complexity it has determinants at 3 different levels: the department, the degree program, and the institution level. And the thing I want you to get from this slide is that those different components can differently predict student outcome. So we can say more complicated degree programs have this effect. Institutions with more complicated gen ed structures have that effect. We're not going to do that because there's only 26 institutions. But we could also say within a degree program, more complex departments have such and such an effect. And so it's that purple departmental level effect that's the one that's going to be really important in terms of thinking about the change management that Steve is always talking about. Of, is this something we should pay attention to? Well, if it has a big effect for having a higher than normal curricular complexity for your degree program, then yeah, that's worth looking into and worth paying attention to. So here is a list of all the variables that we've collected at the student level. And you've seen this list before. The outcomes are bolded. The really big thing to pay attention to are sex, race, ethnicity, Pell, first gen. Those are sort of the demographics that we're going to be looking at. And then standardized test scores, high school GPA, and prior earned credits are what we call preparedness variables. So every analysis from now on is going to have the exact same list of predictors with some very, very minor differences. There's when we get to the tables, the bottom row will be different, but everything else will be the same. Okay, so we collected all this data and we're going to do amazing things with it. The purpose of collecting data and the purpose of doing research, in my opinion, is to tell stories. I love stories. And so our story from CAP is the story of student progress through the university. We have information about how they enter the university. Do they enter in a complex program? Do they enter in undeclared? Do they enter in a pre-major? So on and so forth. We know whether or not they were retained after the first year. We have data on the sequence of majors they enrolled in and when they changed majors throughout their academic career. We have data about their cumulative GPA, the total number of credit hours they enrolled, the total number of credit hours they earned. And we also, of course, have data about whether or not a student graduated and if they did, when they graduated. So we can talk about all these different phases in a student's progress through the university. And so we kind of have these 5 major categories of outcomes that we're going to look at. And I apologize in advance for the yellow. I should have done red, orange, green, blue, purple. The yellow is just obnoxious. So in each of these categories, in each of these phases of student progress through the university, we have some outcomes. I'm listing them here for you, just kind of, we'll send this presentation out just so that you can kind of, here's a list of outcomes we're looking at. And one of the reasons I'm giving this list of outcomes and trying to stress, here are the things I'm looking at, is because you might have other things you care about. And if you have questions, comments, concerns, or ideas, I don't know if you can post in chat, but I do know that you can email Aaron. And Aaron will take all those emails, send you very nice replies, and then send Michael and I summaries of what everyone says. So, you know, everyone in this room, everyone in this call, I guess, has different priorities and different things that they're interested in terms of the student experience and student outcomes. And if you're listening to me talk and you're saying, why isn't he talking about this? Well, email Aaron, because maybe I'm not talking about it because we just didn't think of it. I'm not an expert in higher education. I'm an expert in quantitative analysis. So if there are issues that you think we might not be thinking about, or other avenues you think we should be pursuing, send Aaron an email, and we will do as much as time allows. So the models that we're going to fit are all kind of the same. There's a student outcome. It's predicted by curricular complexity, by the demographic variables, and by the readiness variables. And then if you might be unfamiliar with this whole arrow is pointing to the line with the X in it, and what's that all about? The notion is interactions between curricular complexity at the department level, that's the part that you can change, and the demographic variables and readiness variables. So as an example, we might say, is high complexity a bigger problem for first generation students than non-first generation students? That's the kind of question those interaction effects are going to be addressing. And I'll say about that later. These models are all, like I said, in a multi-level structural equation modeling framework. And so what that does is it allows us to separate out influences by the level. The department, the degree program, the institution level are all kind of modeled separately within this framework. And it allows us to do, well, one, do bigger and better things, but also to have more trustworthy results than if we were to do this in a classical, like, logistic regression framework or something like that. I will mention briefly machine learning at the very end, but we're not going to be using Michael and I at least are not going to be using machine learning as our primary way of looking at this data, largely because of the difficulty machine learning has in having many groups. If you have many groups in machine learning, you need to use dimensionality reduction techniques that lose some information, and that loss of information is going to be a problem. Anyway, so our first phase is in entering the university. And when a student enters the university, we can try to predict the complexity of the degree program that they enter in. It would not be meaningful to predict the department level complexity of their entering that they enter into, just because a student doesn't really have access to that information. It would all just be coincidental. We can also predict whether or not a student enters as undeclared or as a pre-major. I know several people are very interested in pre-majors. We don't really have anything profound to say about pre-majors at this time. In order to really say something important about pre-majors, we'll have to look at individual schools that, you know, do or do not have pre-major policies, and especially ones that change pre-major policies. You know, there's one school that, like, everyone before 2016 had a pre-major and everyone after didn't. And so we can do kind of single case design sort of studies on some of that data. We'll have interesting pre-major results at a much later date. That's not high on my priority list though. But entering curricular complexity of the degree program is something we can look at pretty easily. And I've got this table here of predictors of your entering degree program curricular complexity. So men enter higher complexity majors, higher complexity degree programs than women. This is not surprising. Students with higher math standardized test scores, higher prior earned credits, more AP credits or international baccalaureate credits, and a higher high school GPA, they also enroll in more complex degree programs. We found some very surprising results with race, ethnicity, and international students. As a side note, because of the way race, ethnicity, and international data is collected via FAFSA, we don't ever get any race data about international students, and the FAFSA has Hispanic as a racial category. And so race, ethnicity, and international is kind of a single variable. So I don't know what you would call it. I can't think of the right term, but I call it race eth int is the name of the variable in my analyses. And you could have a race eth int of, say, white or black or American Indian or international or Hispanic, but not any combination thereof, because the data collection mechanisms don't support that. There is a multi-racial category, and that's from the FAFSA. Anyway, those had somewhat surprising results. That's something that was not what I expected, has an exclamation mark and a question mark next to it. And as far as international is concerned, I think this is probably a problem with our data imputation model. International students tend to be missing high school GPA, prior earned credits, and standardized test score data. They naturally have no Pell Award data, and they're usually missing first generation data. So international students are largely missing on some of those other variables. And it's my guess that the model we use to fill in the missing data, the imputation model, kind of made some mistakes regarding international students. So we'll have to go and do that with a very fine tooth comb. And similarly with not white students. There's this third column over here called interaction with, curricular complexity of the department level. And that's not relevant for the entering curricular complexity, but it will be relevant anytime we're predicting an outcome with curricular complexity. As a predictor, we will also consider all the interactions of all these predictor variables over on the left with the departmental level curricular complexity. But that's just not relevant here. I include it in the table so all the tables have the same format. So in this step, in this phase of student experience in the university, we have a bunch of next steps. One is to figure out really how to do the pre-major and undeclareds well, and figure out how to treat them. That's something that shows up in all of our other analyses. Pre-major, being in a pre-major has, I call it a marginal effect, which is averaged across everyone in our sample. That is very large and very negative. But since pre-majors tend to belong to certain universities and certain programs, there are some programs at some universities that everyone has to enter as a pre-major. And so it's very difficult to distinguish the effect of pre-major from the effect of just being in that program. So there's some work that needs to be done analytically to make sure we're treating pre-major and undeclared variables correctly, and that we can trust that the results we report with them are based on being in a pre-major and not based on conflation of being in a pre-major with being in specific programs at specific universities. So that's a work in progress. We're also going to do a bunch of sensitivity analyses. These sensitivity analyses apply for basically every analysis I'm going to talk about. One is to consider two-digit SIP separately. So if you're familiar with mixed effect modeling and or multi-level structural equation modeling, you'll have heard of random effects. And pretty much every coefficient computed in all these analyses has random effects across SIP codes. And so to get a handle on what those mean and how substantial they are, we're going to redo every analysis for each individual two-digit SIP code. So if you're not familiar with the SIP code system, it's classification of instructional programs or codes for instructional programs. I don't know. It's something that iPads does. And engineering, for example, is SIP code 14. And psychology, for example, is SIP code 51 or 52 or something. And business is a two-digit SIP code, and so on and so forth. Humanities are a specific two-digit SIP code. So there's about a dozen two-digit SIP codes that have a sample size of at least 5,000 or so. And so we'll do all of our analyses separately for two-digit SIP codes to see whether or not they're the same. We might end up having to report, well, majors belonging to this type of major, or programs belonging to this type of thing, have these effects. If they belong to that type of thing, they have other effects. So there could be a very complicated relationship between the type of degree program and how impactful certain predictor variables and curricular complexity itself are. So that's just something to be aware of. And one of the reasons why my middle column is marginal effect. It's averaged over the entire sample. And averaged over the entire sample might not be meaningful. We are doing work to make sure that it is. And if it's not, to report separately for cases where there's a different effect, and where the marginal effect might not be applicable. So we're handling a lot of that. Also, there are what are called cross-level interactions, wherein a more complex degree program might have a different effect of the departmental level curricular complexity. It's possible, for example, I'm not saying this is the case, but it's possible, for example, that a highly complex degree program, the departmental level curricular complexity just doesn't matter for anything. But in a very simple degree program, the departmental level curricular complexity is very important. And so we're going to be looking into things like that as well. There's a lot of complexity from having 200 some different degree programs in our data, and being respectful and mindful of that complexity is, let's call it a lot of work. So as far as these entering the university phase of analyses are concerned, we do hope to submit a manuscript sometime this spring for publication. There will undoubtedly be a manuscript or several manuscripts about how curricular complexity is distributed, or at the very least, we'll do some presentations at conferences. And this will likely be timed similarly. If we're talking about the distribution of curricular complexity across programs and across universities, it makes sense at the same time to publish about predictors of that complexity. Our next phase, as the student progresses through college, is whether or not they come back the next year. So first year retention is whether or not the student enrolls in the university and enrolls for classwork, enrolls in courses the fall after enrollment. So if you enroll in 2019, fall 2019, then in fall 2020, if you're enrolled, you've been retained. If you're not enrolled, you have not been retained. So we don't care, for example, whether or not the student comes back in the spring semester. They could go for the fall semester, take the spring semester off, come back in the fall semester, that's retained. So if you come back the next fall, you are retained. That's the definition of first year retention. It's an IPEDS variable. So our sample for this is going to be everyone with an entering cohort year less than 2021. The 2021 students, we didn't have their data on whether or not they were retained in fall 2022. And the sample size here says 533,495 because I've also removed students that did not have a degree program in their first year. So if a student entered as undeclared, they're not going to count in this analysis because undeclared students don't have a curricular complexity assigned to them. So when we look at this, we can say more complex, this very first row, complex degree programs. So think mechanical engineering, high complexity, urban studies, low complexity. The marginal effect on average, the more complex the program, the less likely a student is to return the second year. But the departmental complexity hasn't had an effect. So we'll see when we talk about graduation, we'll see that departmental level curricular complexity does have an effect, but maybe the effect of the excess complexity of the curriculum, it hasn't had time to have an impact on the student yet after only 1 year. Okay. And then there are a variety of effects, positive or negative, for person characteristics and for for readiness characteristics and demographic characteristics. I'm not going to go over all those. You'll see a few places an exclamation mark and a question mark, and that just means I was a little surprised by it. Pell Award students, for example, being more likely to return the second year than the first. That surprised me. Maybe it shouldn't have. Pell Award students have better financial support in some sense, in that they got the Pell Award. So maybe that's a contributor there. Surprising things to me have the exclamation mark and the question mark. Some of those I'm sure will make perfect sense to all of you who know this kind of situation very well. And as far as first year retention is concerned, we kind of have very similar next steps as with everything else. We're going to do a whole bunch of sensitivity analyses. We're going to pay very close attention to any weirdness in our data. We're going to dot all of our I's, cross all of our T's before we submit for publication. But first, your attention, I expect to be submitting a manuscript for publication sometime in April. I'm going to go through the rest of it very, very quickly because we're pretty much out of time. You will get a copy of this presentation. Most of the rest of the presentation is results. This had an effect, that didn't have an effect. And so if you've been listening through all, you have hopefully the tools to understand it. I will go over one more slide in great detail. Other than that, I'm going to skim so that you have some time to ask questions at the end. As far as major change is concerned, we looked at 4 different outcomes, whether or not a student ever changed major. And here we only count changes in 4-digit zip code. So if a student changed from pure mathematics to applied mathematics within the same department, within the same 4-digit zip code, actually, that's not the same 4-digit zip code. That is a change of 4-digit zip code. If a student changed from one applied mathematics program to another applied mathematics program at in the same department, that's, applied mathematics focusing on X versus applied mathematics focusing on Y. Those are not really a change in major from our perspective. You have to change your 4-digit zip code to be counted as a major change. We also looked at whether or not a student left their 2-digit zip code, and that would be a large change in major. So changing from mechanical engineering to electrical engineering is, well, it's still engineering. They're pretty similar. It's not a big deal. Changing from electrical engineering to psychology, that's a huge change. So did they leave their 2-digit zip code? And then the number of times they changed their major and the change in curricular complexity from what they enrolled in to where they ended up. Other things we looked at. And there are these tables for each of those. The big thing to take away from this is that across these, there are basically none of those interactions where if we look at number of major changes, if there's a high departmental curricular complexity, if a department is more complex than it needs to be, then that has a positive effect. You have more major changes. People change out of that major. Okay, but that effect doesn't vary based on any of these demographic or readiness variables. Academic progress, we have the number of credit hours attempted, earned, and the total credit hours. And the idea here is that we wanted to know whether or not students in highly complex majors end up having to take more credit hours at the institution. Okay, so that's what we looked at. And we generally found, yes, that's the case. More complex degree programs and excessively complex departments, they had a positive effect on number of credit hours attempted and number of credit hours earned. So the more complex the curriculum, the more hours a student needs to take in order to graduate from that curriculum. These are based on graduates, not all students, because if a student kind of goes halfway, we don't really care how many credit hours they earn. It's only the students who have graduated. It takes more credit hours to graduate from a highly complex program than a less complex program. The really interesting one, the big payoff comes in graduation, I think. It's probably the thing we all care about the most. We want students to be successful, and success in college ultimately means graduating. So we've got 4-year graduation, 6-year graduation, and time to graduation as variables. And there's some restrictions to sample size, right? If we're going to talk about 6-year graduation, a student has to have enrolled at least 6 years ago, or we can't talk about whether or not they graduated in 6 years. We would end up with, I'll just say that. So I'm going to focus on this slide pretty closely before skipping over most of the rest of it. Okay. And this is the effect of all these predictors on 4-year graduation rate. So more complicated degree programs. This is the degree program that a student ends up in. And more complicated departments. So a student is enrolled in a specific department that has a high curricular complexity relative to other departments at other universities in that same degree program. The departmental level curricular complexity and the degree program level curricular complexity, they both have a negative effect on four-year graduation rates. So you're less likely to graduate from a high complexity program than from a low. Men are less likely to graduate in 4 years than women. As far as race and ethnicity are concerned, Black, American, Indian, multiracial, and Hispanic are less likely to graduate than white students, but Asians and international students are more likely to graduate than white students. For what it's worth, Pacific Islanders were also less likely, but not a huge effect. Pell Award and first generation students less likely to graduate. High GPA students, high prior earned credit students, high standardized test score students less likely to graduate in 4 years. And then students who change their major a lot are also, sorry, high high school GPA, high prior earned credits, and high standardized test scores are more likely to graduate in 4 years. A number of major changes is less likely to graduate in 4 years. That is exactly what everyone expects, right? None of us are surprised at all by a single thing in that marginal effects table column, except maybe, it's good to see that the curricular complexity does have an effect on 4-year graduation rate. We can say that now in a way that we couldn't before, because we have 26 different universities and all these different degree programs at each university. You couldn't do this kind of analysis within a single institution, because there's no way within a single institution to know about departmental level curricular complexity. Is that complexity because their degree program or because of choices the department made in structuring their courses, right? So with all these universities, we can finally make these claims in a more rigorous way. Does curricular complexity matter? Yes. Here's the cool part. It matters more for some students than others. If you are a male student, curricular complexity matters even more. Highly complex departmental level curricular complexity is even worse for males than it is for women. It's marginally, on average, it has a negative effect. And it's even worse for male students. It's even worse for international students. But Asian students and international students seem largely immune to the influence of departmental level curricular complexity. It doesn't impact them very much. So the racial and ethnic categories not mentioned over here on this right column, Black, American, Indian, multiracial, Pacific Islander, they get the marginal effect. Departmental level curricular complexity has a negative effect on them, but it has an especially negative effect for Hispanic students. That's no good. When we get to standardized test scores, we find that higher verbal standardized test scores have a ameliorating effect on curricular complexity at the department level. But strangely, high math standardized test scores meet the effect of departmental level curricular complexity is going to be even worse. And that's weird, right? So we'd like to be able to understand why that's happening, because that's not sort of what's expected. We would expect a person with a higher math standardized test score to be, well, better able to deal with high levels of curricular complexity. That's not what was found in the data, though. So this is one of those sensitivity analyses that we're performing, is to look at these effects inside of individual zip codes. Maybe, I don't know if this is the case, I haven't done these analyses yet, but maybe that curricular complexity at the departmental level, it's really only relevant for programs with a large math requirement, right? Well, and in that case, since students with high math standardized test scores are more likely to end up in those departments, that's why they suffer the effects more than students with low standardized test department scores, because the students with lower math standardized test scores end up in different degree programs. So that's a kind of, we'll be able to do some digging to understand why that coefficient is in that direction in our future work. We have similar things for 6-year graduation rate and time to graduation, which had a number of surprising interactions. Nones, by the way, none means either no significant effect or this effect was so small as to be irrelevant. We have 1 million students in our data set, so a statistically significant result is not hugely surprising. There's 1 million students, but it had to be large enough that I thought someone would care before it got a plus or a minus on these tables. And then the NAs are not applicable because we're not interacting department level curricular complexity with itself, as an example. And these manuscripts hopefully will be done, I would like to say by the end of the month, but let's be more realistic and say they'll be submitted to journals in January. We have not yet, as a leadership team, discussed things like publishing what are they called? Preprints, I think. So we'll be submitting to journals on roughly the timelines indicated in these slides. But when formal official results are available to all of you, I can't really say that. And in the long term, if anyone's really interested in all this nerdy statistical stuff, we'll be, as far as graduation is concerned, comparing these multi-level structural equation models to machine learning models in terms of what we can learn about the data and their ability to handle some of the complexity in the data and tell us a story that is meaningful and trustworthy. And that is, let's go to the next slide. That's it. That's our presentation. So we have a little bit of time now for questions, although I talked way longer than I was supposed to. I apologize.
Thank you, David. Really appreciate that. And thanks also to Michael for his work on this presentation. My understanding of it, the bottom line is when we went into the project, and thanks again to Ascendium Education Group for the funding to support this now over 3-year endeavor, we wanted to validate hypotheses and we wanted to get information to universities so they could engage in change, leading change where they saw fit along the way. And what you just have presented, if I understand it correctly, is that we have validated the basic idea that curricular structure has an impact on time to degree and graduation success, and it has a differential impact. There are inequities that where some groups of students see greater challenge than other groups of students, and it's a complex picture, but it's one where we've revealed a hidden type of barrier to student success that, thanks to Greg and the creation of this entire toolkit, was heretofore not top of mind and not accessible to analysis and not available to university leaders to make use of for their planning and for their change management. So that's a significant thing. And that's critical to the entire undertaking. Greg, I don't know if you're there. Do you read this the same way I do?
Yeah, quite interesting. Thank you, David, for the presentation. Lots of caveats.
Yes.
So, and I think that's the thing to try and disentangle some of that. But it's complicated data, and student success is complicated. It's so many different things impact a student's journey to graduation. So that's what makes this hard work.
It really does. But, it's important to, I think another characteristic here, and we just have a few seconds, so I'll be as brief as possible. This gives us a tool, even if the overall impact statistically isn't enormous, and we wouldn't have expected it to be because there's so many other important consequential variables at work, we all realize. But even if there is a statistically significant, meaningful impact, that gives us a reason to engage faculty and other university leaders in examining this aspect of what makes for student success, of what creates context for student success, that can then lead to additional conversations. This is a particularly excellent way of gathering people and focusing their attention on the structure of the institution, but it can lead to conversations about culture, and other, pedagogy, content of classes, student learning environments, any number of additional kinds of conversations. So it's a very useful tool to begin much more complex and robust conversations. We've reached the conclusion of our time, and we do all apologize for not providing more opportunity for you to pose questions or engage. We will post this complicated presentation at the CAP website and keep you informed otherwise as to our progress. Thanks to everyone for joining, especially to Dr. Dueber and Dr. Toland for their work on this presentation. We're grateful to you all, and let me take this opportunity to wish everyone a great holiday season. Goodbye for now.